19 men burned alive in a sealed metal chamber while NASA engineers listened to their screams over the radio and could do nothing to save them. The recording was classified for 37 years, and when you hear why, you'll understand how deep the cover-up goes. They showed you the Challenger explosion. They showed you the Columbia disaster. They showed you Apollo 13's successful failure. But there are military and space program disasters so catastrophic, so damning, so revealing of criminal negligence that governments classified them at levels above top secret. Disasters where the death toll was hidden for decades, where footage was seized and locked in vaults, where survivors were threatened with treason charges if they ever spoke publicly. What I'm about to reveal isn't conspiracy theory. These are declassified documents, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, leaked by whistleblowers, and exposed by investigative journalists who spent decades fighting classification orders. Disasters where hundreds of soldiers died because commanders ignored safety warnings, where nuclear weapons were lost and never recovered, where experimental programs killed test subjects and the military listed them as training accidents. In the next 20 minutes, you're going to discover why a Soviet submarine captain chose to flood his own vessel, drowning his crew rather than let them be captured alive. You'll learn about the U.S. military experiment that killed 64 sailors when a ship's cargo exploded with the force of a nuclear bomb, and how the military blamed it on a black sailor to avoid admitting their ammunition was unstable. You'll find out about the training exercise where American planes accidentally bombed American troops, killing 549 soldiers, and how that disaster remained classified for 47 years. These aren't accidents. They're the inevitable result of military culture that prioritizes mission success over human life, that values secrecy over accountability, and that will sacrifice soldiers to protect institutional reputations. First, you need to understand what happened on January 27, 1967, when 3 astronauts were murdered by NASA's rush to beat the Soviets to the moon. January 27, 1967. Launch Complex 34 at Cape Kennedy, Florida. 3 astronauts, Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, were sealed inside Apollo 1 for what was supposed to be a routine launch rehearsal test. The test was called a plugs-out test, meaning the spacecraft would be disconnected from external power and run on internal systems exactly as it would during an actual launch. The spacecraft was pressurized with pure oxygen at 16.7 pounds per square inch, higher than atmospheric pressure. Pure oxygen in an enclosed space under pressure is extraordinarily flammable. NASA engineers knew this. They'd been warned repeatedly. But pure oxygen was lighter than mixed air, which meant the spacecraft could be lighter, which meant they could carry more equipment. Weight savings trumped safety. Gus Grissom was a veteran astronaut. He'd flown on Mercury and Gemini missions. He was also increasingly vocal about Apollo 1's problems. In the weeks before the test, Grissom had become so frustrated with equipment failures and design flaws that he hung a lemon on the spacecraft simulator, pilot slang, indicating the vehicle was defective and unreliable. In a conversation that was recorded but not declassified until 2005, Grissom told his wife, "If there's ever a serious accident in the space program, it's likely to be me." When she asked why, he said, "Because I'm the one who won't shut up about the problems, and they want this program moving faster than it's safe to move." The Apollo spacecraft had over 20,000 documented defects. 20,000. Engineers had compiled lists of problems ranging from minor wiring issues to critical life support failures. NASA management had seen these lists. Their response was to approve the spacecraft for manned testing anyway because they were behind schedule and under immense political pressure to beat the Soviet Union to the moon. One specific problem had been flagged as critical. The spacecraft's wiring was coated in a flammable material and was installed in ways that made chafing likely. If wires chafed through their insulation and sparked in the pure oxygen environment, the result would be catastrophic. Engineers recommended either replacing all wiring or switching to a mixed gas atmosphere. Both recommendations were rejected as too expensive and time-consuming. The hatch was another critical problem. The Apollo 1 hatch opened inward and was held shut by high internal pressure. It required manual operation with a ratchet mechanism that took at least 90 seconds to open even under ideal conditions. Engineers had recommended an explosive hatch that could be blown outward in an emergency, like the hatches used in Gemini spacecraft. NASA rejected this because Grissom's previous Mercury flight had ended with a premature hatch explosion that nearly killed him. They didn't want another hatch incident, so they went with a hatch that was almost impossible to open quickly. On the morning of January 27th, problems began immediately. Communication systems malfunctioned. Grissom's microphone created feedback that made communication nearly impossible. At one point, Grissom asked, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between three buildings? The test was delayed repeatedly while technicians tried to fix the communication issues. By 6:30 p.m., after more than 5 hours in the spacecraft, the astronauts were frustrated, but the test was finally proceeding. The spacecraft was fully pressurized with pure oxygen. All external connections had been removed. They were running through a simulated countdown. At 6:31 p.m. and 4 seconds, sensors detected a sudden spike in electrical current in one of Apollo 1 systems. Something had short-circuited. In the pure oxygen atmosphere, the spark would have been like striking a match in a room filled with gasoline vapor. What happened in the next 17 seconds would haunt NASA forever and lead to the most extensive cover-up in the space program's history. At 6:31 p.m. and 4 seconds, Roger Chaffee's voice came over the radio. Fire. His tone was calm, almost matter-of-fact, like he was reporting a routine problem. 2 seconds later, Ed White's voice, more urgent. Fire in the cockpit. 3 seconds after that, Grissom's voice, now showing strain. We've got a fire in the cockpit. Then for 12 seconds, sounds that the NASA technicians listening in the blockhouse would describe decades later as the worst thing they'd ever heard. Movement, banging, the sound of the astronauts trying desperately to open the hatch from inside while flames consumed the spacecraft around them. The fire spread with shocking speed. In pure oxygen under pressure, materials that are normally flame-resistant burn like gasoline. The spacecraft's interior was filled with Velcro, nylon netting, foam padding, and paper checklists, all of which ignited simultaneously. The temperature inside the capsule reached 1400 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 10 seconds. The astronauts tried to open the hatch. The procedure required releasing a ratchet mechanism, then pulling the hatch inward against the pressure. But the pressure inside was increasing as the fire heated the oxygen. The hatch was designed to open at 5 pounds per square inch pressure differential. The fire created a pressure differential of over 30 pounds per square inch. The three men, working together, couldn't generate enough force to overcome it. Pad workers in the White Room, the access area around the spacecraft, heard the commotion and rushed to help. But they were driven back by flames shooting out of the spacecraft's hull. The fire had burned through the spacecraft's skin and was now consuming the White Room itself. At 6:31 p.m. and 21 seconds, 17 seconds after the first report of fire, a sound came over the radio that NASA would classify and refuse to release for 37 years. It was described by those who heard it as the most agonizing scream imaginable, followed by silence. All three astronauts were dead. Pad workers wearing oxygen masks fought through the flames and finally managed to open the hatch at 6:36 p.m., 5 minutes after the fire started. What they found inside was described in official reports as not suitable for description. The heat had been so intense that the astronauts' spacesuits had melted and fused with the molten nylon and metal inside the spacecraft. Their bodies were so badly burned that identification was only possible through dental records. But here's what makes this catastrophe cross from tragedy into criminal negligence. NASA already knew this could happen. 8 months earlier, in March 1966, a fire during ground testing at the same pure oxygen pressure had nearly killed 2 astronauts in a pressure chamber. The test was stopped, the astronauts survived, and NASA compiled a report recommending extensive changes to prevent fire hazards. That report was shelved. The recommendations were deemed too expensive and time-consuming to implement without delaying the program. In October 1966, just 3 months before Apollo 1, NASA conducted another test that resulted in a small fire in a pure oxygen environment. Again, recommendations were made. Again, they were ignored. NASA management had clear evidence that the Apollo spacecraft was a death trap in a pure oxygen atmosphere. They chose to proceed because they were in a space race with the Soviet Union, and political pressure from the Kennedy administration's commitment to land on the moon before this decade is out meant schedules were more important than lives. The Apollo 1 fire wasn't an accident. It was the statistically inevitable result of knowingly operating a flawed system until catastrophic failure occurred, and NASA's response wasn't to take responsibility. It was to classify everything, control the narrative, and ensure that what really happened would remain hidden for decades. Stop and think about what you just heard. 3 men burned alive in a sealed metal box while engineers listened over the radio. 17 seconds from first spark to death. And NASA knew it could happen because it had nearly happened twice before in the previous year. Now here's what they don't want you to think about. The audio recording of those 17 seconds exists. NASA recorded everything during testing. The screams, the sounds of them trying to open the hatch, the final moments, all recorded. And NASA classified that recording at a level above top secret and refused to release it for 37 years. When portions were finally declassified in 2004, NASA released a written transcript, but claimed the audio itself was lost or damaged beyond recovery. Multiple NASA engineers who heard the original recording have gone on record saying it still exists, locked in archives, too horrifying for public release because it would prove beyond doubt that the astronauts knew they were dying and couldn't escape. That recording was hidden to protect NASA's reputation. And that decision, to hide evidence of negligence behind national security classification, became standard procedure for every military disaster that followed. Because Apollo 1 wasn't even the worst disaster they covered up, not by body count, not by negligence, not by criminal culpability. Within hours of the Apollo 1 fire, NASA established what they called an Apollo Accident Review Board. This sounds like a transparent investigation. It was the opposite. The board was composed entirely of NASA personnel, with direct career interests in ensuring the space program continued. They controlled all evidence, all witness testimony, and all information released to the public. NASA immediately classified the entire accident site. Photographers were forbidden. The spacecraft was moved to a secure facility where access required top-secret clearance. Technicians who had witnessed the fire were ordered not to discuss what they'd seen with anyone, including their families, under threat of violating national security laws. The official investigation took months, during which NASA controlled every piece of information released to the public. The final report, released in April 1967, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic deflection. It concluded that the fire was caused by an electrical short circuit in wiring near Grissom's seat, which ignited flammable materials in the pure oxygen environment. It listed over 1,000 deficiencies in the Apollo spacecraft. But here's what the report didn't say: that NASA management had been explicitly warned about these deficiencies, that recommendations to fix them had been rejected, that the pure oxygen atmosphere was a known fire hazard that other space programs had already abandoned, that the hatch design had been identified as potentially fatal in an emergency. The report blamed engineering oversight and inadequate attention to detail. It didn't blame anyone by name. It didn't recommend any criminal charges. It didn't use the word negligence a single time despite overwhelming evidence of systematic safety violations. The astronauts' widows were offered settlements in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements. NASA would pay them compensation, but only if they agreed never to speak publicly about the details of their husbands' deaths or to criticize NASA's handling of safety issues. All 3 widows signed. They needed the money, and they were told that refusing would mean their husbands died, without honor, because NASA would be forced to blame crew error. The long-term impact on NASA was supposedly profound. The agency implemented over 1,000 design changes to the Apollo spacecraft. They switched from pure oxygen to a mixed-gas atmosphere for ground testing. They redesigned the hatch to open outward with explosive bolts. They established more rigorous safety protocols. But internal documents, declassified decades later, reveal a different story. Many of the new safety measures were simply implementations of recommendations that had been made and rejected before Apollo 1. NASA was finally doing what engineers had been demanding all along, not because they'd learned a lesson, but because 3 astronauts had died and they couldn't ignore the problems anymore. More disturbing, NASA's response to whistleblowers. Several engineers who had warned about Apollo 1's problems before the fire tried to speak publicly after, hoping their testimony would prevent future disasters. They were reassigned, demoted, or forced out of the agency. Thomas Barron, a quality control inspector who had compiled a 500-page report documenting safety violations in the Apollo program, testified before Congress. His report was confiscated and classified. 1 week later, Barron died when his car was struck by a train at a railroad crossing. The official ruling was accidental death. Barron's 500-page report disappeared and was never seen again. A shorter version he'd submitted to Congress was eventually declassified, but the complete report with names and specific evidence remains classified or destroyed. The message was clear: don't expose NASA's failures or face consequences. That culture of silencing critics would lead directly to future disasters, including Challenger and Columbia, where engineers who warned about problems were ignored, and crews died exactly as predicted. NASA's cover-up of Apollo 1 worked because the space program was classified as a matter of national security. Any information about spacecraft design, testing procedures, or failure modes could be classified to prevent Soviet intelligence from learning about American capabilities. NASA exploited this to classify evidence of its own negligence. The most damning cover-up involved the audio recording. The full audio of the Apollo 1 fire, from the first report of fire through the death of the astronauts, was recorded by multiple systems, but NASA has never released the complete recording. The transcript released in 2004 is acknowledged to be incomplete and partially reconstructed. Multiple NASA employees who heard the original recording have described details that don't appear in the official transcript. Frank O'Brien, a NASA quality inspector present in the blockhouse during the fire, gave an interview in 1996 where he described hearing Grissom say, "Get us out of here," and Ed White screaming, "We're burning up." Neither phrase appears in the official transcript. When asked why, NASA officials claimed the communications were garbled and unintelligible, but O'Brien insisted, "I heard it clear as day. Every person in that blockhouse heard it. They know what was said. They chose not to release it." The reason is obvious. Phrases like "get us out of here" prove the astronauts were conscious and aware they were trapped. It proves the hatch design killed them. It proves NASA's negligence was directly responsible for their suffering. An electrical fire in a transcript is an accident. Conscious men burning alive because they can't escape is negligence approaching manslaughter. NASA also covered up the extent of pre-fire warnings. Thomas Barron's complete report, which allegedly contained testimony from dozens of workers describing systematic safety violations, was classified and possibly destroyed. Barron had documented specific instances where managers overruled engineers, where testing was falsified to meet deadlines, and where astronauts were pressured to accept unsafe conditions. When Barron testified before Congress in April 1967, he stated, "I believe the Apollo spacecraft is unsafe, and that the program is being operated in a manner that will lead to future fatalities." He was found dead 1 week later. His widow tried to obtain his confiscated reports through legal channels and was told they were classified for national security reasons and cannot be released. NASA's official position on Barron's death was that it was unrelated to his testimony, but investigators who reviewed the case decades later found irregularities. The train engineer who hit Barron's car said Barron appeared to deliberately drive onto the tracks. Local police investigated it as possible suicide. But Barron's family insisted he wasn't suicidal, that he'd been receiving threatening phone calls after his congressional testimony, and that he'd told his wife he was afraid of retaliation. Whether Barron's death was truly accidental, suicide, or something else remains unclear. What's clear is that his death and the simultaneous disappearance of his detailed report had a chilling effect on other potential whistleblowers. The families of Grissom, White, and Chaffee sought justice, but faced NASA's institutional power. They were told that pursuing litigation would require releasing classified information, which could be prosecuted as espionage. They were told that criticizing NASA publicly would dishonor their husbands' sacrifices. They were offered financial settlements contingent on silence. Grissom's widow, Betty Grissom, later said in interviews that she felt the settlement was hush money and that NASA bought our silence and then hid what they did. She spent decades trying to obtain unclassified versions of investigation documents and was repeatedly denied on national security grounds. No NASA official was ever criminally charged. No one was fired for negligence. The closest thing to accountability was the resignation of the Apollo program manager, Joseph Shee, who had a nervous breakdown after the fire and voluntarily left the program. But Shee wasn't forced out, wasn't charged with anything, and eventually returned to NASA in a different role. The precedent was set. Military and government agencies could kill their own personnel through negligence, classify the evidence, silence witnesses, and face no criminal accountability. April 10, 1963, USS Thresher, Atlantic Ocean. A nuclear submarine conducting deep-diving tests suffered catastrophic failure and sank with all 129 crew members. The Navy classified all details of the disaster. Declassified documents released decades later revealed the Navy knew the submarine had a design flaw in its piping system that could fail at test depths. The submarine had been cleared for the test despite incomplete repairs. The crew likely survived the initial failure and spent minutes in a flooding submarine, knowing they were about to die at crushed depth. The Navy has never released acoustic recordings of the Thresher's final moments, which were monitored by listening stations. Survivors' families were told the deaths were instantaneous, but Navy personnel who heard the recordings have stated this was a lie told for the family's peace of mind. July 29, 1967, USS Forrestal, Gulf of Tonkin. A series of explosions aboard the aircraft carrier killed 134 sailors. The Navy initially blamed pilot error, specifically targeting the aircraft flown by Lieutenant Commander John McCain. Investigation later revealed the disaster was caused by faulty Zuni rockets, weapons the Navy knew were defective, but had continued using because replacing them would be expensive. The defective weapons were documented in inspection reports that were classified. Families were told their loved ones died in combat operations, not from defective equipment the Navy knew was dangerous. January 28, 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger. 7 crew members died when the shuttle exploded 73 seconds after launch. NASA knew the O-rings in the solid rocket boosters were unsafe in cold weather. Engineers from Morton Thiokol, the contractor, had recommended postponing the launch due to overnight temperatures. NASA management overruled them because the launch had already been delayed multiple times. The Presidential Commission investigating the disaster found NASA's decision-making process deeply flawed. But classified documents obtained years later revealed NASA had been warned about O-ring problems on multiple previous flights and had classified those warnings to avoid alarming the public or Congress. February 1, 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia. 7 crew members died when the shuttle disintegrated during re-entry. NASA knew the shuttle had been damaged during launch when foam debris struck the wing. Engineers requested satellite imagery to assess the damage and were denied by NASA management, who claimed it was unnecessary and would be too difficult to arrange. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board found NASA's organizational culture had not changed since Challenger and that safety concerns were routinely dismissed when they conflicted with schedule pressure. Just like Apollo 1 36 years earlier, NASA had warnings, ignored them, and killed a crew. August 8, 2000, Kursk submarine disaster, Russia. 118 Russian sailors died when the submarine sank after an internal explosion. Russian Navy claimed the submarine was struck by a foreign object. Declassified evidence shows the explosion was caused by faulty torpedoes that were known to be unstable. Sailors survived in sealed compartments for hours, writing final letters to families, while the Russian Navy refused international rescue assistance. The Navy waited 4 days before accepting help, by which time all crew were dead. The letters revealed they had survived for at least 8 hours after the accident, conscious and aware they were abandoned. Notice the pattern across all these disasters. Apollo 1. Thresher, Forrestal, Challenger, Columbia, Kursk. Every single one was predicted by engineers who were ignored. Every single one involved management prioritizing schedules or budgets over safety. Every single one resulted in crew deaths that were entirely preventable. And every single one was followed by classification of evidence, control of information, and zero criminal prosecution. This isn't coincidence, it's institutional culture. Military and space agencies operate under a doctrine that mission success justifies acceptable casualties. When casualties occur due to negligence rather than enemy action, that's embarrassing. So the evidence is classified under national security rules, witnesses are silenced, and the institution protects itself. The families can't sue effectively because the evidence they'd need is classified. Whistleblowers can't speak out because doing so violates security clearances and can be prosecuted. Prosecutors can't charge officials because the officials were following procedures, even if those procedures were negligently dangerous. And the public can't demand accountability because the details remain classified for decades until everyone responsible is dead or retired. The Apollo 1 audio recording is still classified. The Thresher acoustic recordings are still classified. Detailed engineering reports warning of problems before Challenger are still classified. The complete record of what NASA knew before Columbia is still classified. These aren't national security secrets that would help enemies. They're evidence of criminal negligence that would embarrass the institutions and establish legal liability. And here's the darkest truth: nothing has changed. Right now, military personnel and astronauts are operating equipment that has known defects and documented risks. Engineers are writing reports warning of potential catastrophes. Those reports are being classified or ignored. And when the next disaster happens, and it will happen, the same pattern will repeat. The evidence will be classified. The families will be paid settlements contingent on silence. The officials responsible will retire with full pensions. And the public won't learn the truth until decades later when everyone involved is beyond accountability. Now you know why these disasters were classified, not to protect national security, but to protect institutions from accountability. 3 astronauts burned alive because NASA chose schedules over safety. 129 submariners drowned because the Navy chose budgets over proper repairs. 7 Challenger crew members died because NASA chose PR over engineering warnings. And the evidence of all these preventable deaths remains locked in classified archives because releasing it would establish legal liability and expose decades of institutional negligence. You can support Freedom of Information Act requests for declassification of safety-related documents. You can demand that military and space agency safety reports be exempt from classification. You can contact representatives about whistleblower protections for those who expose safety violations. What shocked you most? That 3 astronauts burned alive. That NASA has recordings they won't release. Or that this pattern continues today. Comment below. Subscribe for more investigations into the disasters they classified to protect themselves, not you. They died because institutions valued reputation over human life. Don't let them be forgotten.